Good morning, everyone. Shabbat Shalom. All right, let me begin with a blessing over the Torah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech ha'olam, asher kedeshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asach b'divrei Torah. Amen. Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who has made us holy through his commandments and has commanded us to engage in the study of the words of Torah. All right, so this week we are beginning a new Torah portion and more. And my focus for this Torah portion will be on two central themes. I'm going to spend my first theme, which is the title of my presentation, what it means to have something eternal and preserve it. I'm going to talk about that. And I also want to talk about the other theme, which is a more messianic theme that the rabbis hint at in this Torah portion. So we come to our first verse, Leviticus 21, verse 1. It says, Vayomer Hashem el Moshe. God said to Moses, speak to the priest. It says, Emor el kohanim. Speak to the priest, b'nei Acharon, va'amarta alechem, le'nefesh lo etama ba'amav. No one shall defile himself for any dead among his kin. And already off the bat, you can notice a redundancy. And the rabbis point out, sometimes there are redundancies in the Torah portion. And when we see a redundancy, what it's telling us is we need to stop. We need to pause and consider what's going on. Think of it this way. I'm talking to my friend Stevie. And I'm telling Stevie to tell Marcel a funny joke. So I will say to Stevie, Stevie, speak to Marcel. And speak to him. That's kind of what's going on here. Hashem said to Moses, Emor el ha-kohanim. Speak to the priests, the sons of Aaron, va'amarta, and speak to them. There's a double expression. Why did the Parsha have a double expression here? Says Rashi, say and again you will say unto them, this is a repetition meant, and it is intended to admonish the adults about their children also, that they should teach them to avoid defilement. So let's think about that a little bit. Let's think about the theme of what this chapter, what this Parsha is about. And realize that the instructions given are not just for the priests. They're not just for the sons of Aaron, but they're also for the sons of the sons of Aaron, and their sons, and their sons, and their sons. Because an identity can be lost if it is not preserved. So, it must be preserved. Let's look at the word emor. Emor is how they're supposed to speak to their children. It's not dabar, which is a term of harshness, but emor, which is that top word in Hebrew, which means speak. If I can get my mouse. That one. It's a softer form of expression that we are to speak softly in teaching our children Hebrew. And Rashi uses the word lachaz here to illuminate. That when we are teaching our children Torah, the purpose of it is to make the Torah bright, because the root of lachazir is zachar, which means to shine bright. So that every time they open up God's word, the word of God shines brightly for them. Because the first step in preparing a group of adults that will one day sanctify the Torah, will one day stand in the place of all Israel in the sanctuary, is preparing them from the moment they are born. From the moment they are born, you're instilling in them an idea that this is sacred, that there's delight in this, there's beauty in the sacrificial system, there's beauty in the Torah, and it's bright for them. It's kind of interesting because in my studies for this week, I happened to stumble across an article by a rabbi that was talking about how yes, we have these legal rules for the Kohanim, but really the Sanhedrin, that was the ruling government body of the nation of Israel, that really did not control the priesthood. The priesthood functioned as its own separate entity and was able to do so because the priests themselves had been, from the moment they were born, instilled with a sense of God's holiness and how to serve in the temple and what it meant to follow the systems and rules. And that is the mission here. It says in verses 2 to 3, Ki'im lish ero. This is talking about the priests. They are not to desecrate themselves. And we go back up to the verse 1. It says, none shall defile himself for a nephesh. That means for a dead person amongst his kin. And it continues in verses 2 to 3. Except for the relatives that are closest to him. His mother, his father, his son, his daughter, and his brother, for his virgin sister who is near him, who is not for a man in marriage. For her he may make himself unclean. It's talking about as the priest. There's a system that you have to follow. As a priest, you cannot bury someone who's not an immediate family member. And it's called Bet Amav. That means among the people. Because if someone dies and you are the only one to bury them, that's called a mes mitzvah. That's a commandment to bury that dead person. But if there's someone else there to do it, because of your priestly status, you can't be the one to bury that person because that person's tameh clings to you. And as a priest, you have to keep yourself tahor, which means pure, spiritually pure. So there's our rules, as you can see, that even the children themselves must learn. From childhood, they must learn this. And we talked about the mes mitzvah. But he shall not defile himself by marriage among his people and profane himself. This is also showing that from the time this young boy is getting ready to grow up, he also has to consider that he is a leader amongst his people. The word used for marriage is Baal. It's that red Hebrew word you see up there. That word can mean a leader or it can also mean a husband. So what it's telling you is his whole life he's preparing to serve God. He's preparing to serve God, but how he chooses to live his life along the way, the decisions he makes, impacts that. So he has to decide, what decisions am I going to make? How is that going to affect me as a leader amongst the people? Who am I going to marry? These are questions that he has to ask. And as the priest, there are limitations. It's also, there are certain things he has to do with himself, like he is not supposed to shave. It says, lo yichachu. He's not supposed to shave or cut or make gashes in himself. And what this is it's an allusion to last week's Torah portion, where the priest says, if I can get the words out, where the children of Israel were commanded the same things. Not to make gashes in their flesh or make marks or destroy their beards or round off the scalps of their heads. And really, this is an allusion, what Rashi says, to the pagan practices of the day. It was common for those days in the lands of Canaan, for when you lost someone you loved, you made marks in yourself. You took a blade, you made cuts in yourself. And that was part of a pagan practice they had. So for the priesthood, they were not supposed to have any sign of paganism amongst themselves, even down to their style of how they dressed or even what they did with their own bodies. We talked about choosing the right spouse, and that is important. It talks about a woman defiled. That's someone who's even done once, like in a relationship with someone she's not supposed to have been with, someone divorced. These are the restrictions on the priest. There's a lot we could get into that, but I want to talk more about the more other portions of this Torah portion. There are stringent rules for the high priest that followed some of the similar rules for the regular priest. We talked about, in this week's Torah portion, what happens when high priests or priests have a blemish, they're disqualified. Restrictions are placed upon those who are tameh in Israel. There's restrictions on offerings that are blemished, so if the offering becomes blemished, it can't be offered. Then we talked in Leviticus 23 about the chuk olam. Those are the commandments regarding the feast days, and they're called chuk olam because they're an eternal decree. The continual lighting of the menorah is another chuk olam, and it is called tamid, which means it's continual. It doesn't go away. And laws regarding showbread, which are called brit olam. Brit olam means covenant that is eternal, and chuk olam, which means an eternal decree. And a chuk is a commandment that we don't understand the meaning of. God told us to light the menorah candles. I don't know why I'm supposed to do it, but I know God told me. And as I grow in my spiritual walk, God will illuminate my understanding. So as we go through the rest of this Torah portion, we notice something really important. Every component of these commandments that are given throughout the Torah portion, they carry a sense of continuality, a sense of eternity, right? It's going on. Olam means forever. And here's the meaning of that. One day, like take for instance the candles, the high priest has to light the candles in the morning and the evening every day. The meaning of that is he has to light the candles every day. And one day he will no longer light the candles. The next high priest will. And then the next day, years down the road, the high priest after that does. But while that high priest is lighting the candles, you have the next one coming up in training. And that starts when they're children. The choices parents make impacts where their children turn out. The choices the priests make impacts who their children will be. On a deeper spiritual level, the choices you make, who you decide to join to, it could possibly not be a person, but whatever things you bring in your life, right? Spiritual, or maybe a job or emotions or whatnot you choose to identify with. That gives fruit to actions. And those actions are an offshoot of that union. And as priests, which we all are in our own way, we have a commandment to safeguard our own priesthood. We have a commandment to sanctify our own sanctuary. Because we are told that we are a sanctuary of God. That God told the children to build a mikdash. Why? Shechanti betochem, so that I may dwell inside them. When the children of Israel went to the Mishkan, when they went to the temple, and they went through all the rituals, it seems like rote, but it is not just rote. It seems like I'm going through the motions of my religious walk, and there's all these rules I have to follow. And if I step out of line on God's temple, I'm dead. And I'm trying to preserve my life here because I am approaching a God that is holy, but at the same time, when I'm done with this experience and I go back to my house, I understand that really that temple experience was to teach me that I'm a temple. And as we as Israelites coming out of our exile maintain our identity, because that's what Torah is to do. It's to teach us our identity. When we come out of exile, as we're coming out of the night into the day, we begin to realize that this is an identity that can be lost. Like the priesthood, that if they did not train up their sons, right, daily, did not sit their little 5-year-old boy on their knees and teach him the Torah and make Torah a delight to him. If they did not do that, the priesthood, the sanctity of it, this beautiful way of approaching God would be lost. So daily we must rekindle that fire in ourselves. Daily we must rekindle that so that it is not lost. Because it can be lost. Because you can wake up one morning and feel like I am on fire for God. But with the things you are joining to, the things you are allowing in your life, and I've been there, and in many ways I am there. When you wake up and you realize I'm not as close to God as I used to, then you know you can start again. You know that after everything, He's still there. He's the God who is there. And it's kind of interesting because that leads to my next theme. And I'm not going to talk about a brief look at something before we go to our next theme. I don't think it's an accident that the last part of our Torah portion deals with the man who takes the Lord's name in vain. I don't think that is an accident. Because all through the Torah portion, we're told not to desecrate God's name. That's a repeated commandment. You shall not desecrate God's name. And also, you're to remember that you are holy before God. And you're not supposed to desecrate His holy place. And then at the end of the Torah portion, this is in, by the way, if you want to know, I did not put the reference up, but it's in Leviticus 24. We're told that a man whose mother was an Israelite and his father was an Egyptian. So here you have something that is part of God's camp joined with something that is not. What does that result in? It results in this man who desecrates God's name. If God's sanctity is not trained into our children or daily in us, the result is a desecration of God's name. We lose the sanctity. And I've already said this, but I say it to lead to my next perspective. What happens when you lose that sanctity? I want to go back to Leviticus 21, verses 1 through 3. It says, Vayomer Hashem el Moshe. God spoke to Moses, saying, Emor el ha-kohanim b'nei Acharon. Speak to the sons of Aaron, va'amarta alechem, and speak to them again. L'nefesh lo etama ba'amav. A nefesh, that is a dead person or a soul, amongst the people you will not make yourself impure for. And ki'im lish'ero, except for the nearest relatives. And it goes on to talk about his father, his mother, his son, his daughter, and his brother. Then it talks about the virgin sister. La'achota chabatola, who is near him, who is not a man for a man in marriage. She is not married, meaning once a woman gets married, she leaves behind her main family and adopts the husband's new family. So she's no longer a part of that family. So in the case, you guys would know my sister Elizabeth. If I were a priest, the way this would work is, God forbid, my sister, I have to bury her. Because she's not married, as a priest, that would fall on me. May Elizabeth live long and prosper and all that. But if she were married, that would be the responsibility of her husband. As a priest, I could not desecrate myself for that. Here's an interesting thing. The high priest's rules are more stringent. It says, Va'al kol nafshot mes. That is for every person who is dead. Lo yavo la'aviv u'l'imo. He will not defile himself even for his father or his mother. Think about that. Even for the closest family relatives, a high priest can't defile himself, but a priest can, a common priest can. This leads to the question, who is the virgin sister really? And the Zohar has an interesting answer. It looks at Isaiah 63, verses 1 to 3. It says, who is this coming from Edom with rancid and bloody clothes from Batsura? I am the one who speaks in righteousness, mighty to save. All my garments I have soiled. Israel is God's virgin sister who has not married a man, who has resisted all the alien masters she has been subject to through her exile. For her sake, God contaminates himself to battle her enemies and to raise her from the dust. See that? That's you. This is Isaiah. This is the Zohar commenting on Isaiah 63, 1 through 3. And the verse is talking about how God is contaminating himself to fight on Israel's behalf. Think about that. Look around. That's not just the Jewish people, because the Jewish people are a part of Israel. They're the tribe of Judah. They're the southern kingdom. But it's also for the northern kingdoms that went into exile. It's for you and me who were scattered amongst the nations. Our fathers were scattered amongst the nations in the conquest by the Assyrian captivity. And they lost their genealogy. They lost their identity. But somehow today we're still in this room. We claim Yeshua as our Messiah. We claim the feast days of the Lord. We claim the Torah. And we're trying to know God and his commandments. I think that describes us. Let's look at some numerology. La Itama. For her, he will contaminate himself. And you look at Itama. You look at, I'm going to use the mouse here. Where's my mouse? I'm going to use the dot. Right there, that yod has a numerical value of 10. That has a numerical value of 9. That has a numerical value of 40. That has a numerical value of 1. You add them all up, you get 60, which is the Hebrew letter representing death, because 60 represents death. And it's also the Hebrew letter samak, which has a numerical value of 60. And this is why this is so interesting. Because if you turn to Psalm 145, verse 14, it says that God somech. It says, somech Hashem l'chol hanofalim. God supports the fallen. That's you and me. Somech is the same Hebrew word for samech. God supports the fallen. Now here is where it gets really interesting. This is where it gets really deep. Last week, what were we talking about here in this room? We're talking about Yom Kippur. We're talking about on Yom Kippur, what does the high priest do? He performs his ritual before God out on the altar, and he performs the daily offerings plus the Yom Kippur offerings. But when he goes inside the parochet, inside the curtain, what does he do? It's different from what he normally does. He changes his clothes. Because when he's normally the high priest, he wears 8 garments, right? He wears the white linen, he wears the white linen shorts, he wears the turban, he wears the sash, and he wears the ephod, the Urim and Thummim, the breastplate, the mitre. This is what he wears normally. 8 garments. But when he goes before God, he goes before God as a priest. And if you remember, the high priest can't defile himself for his close family. The high priest can't do that. Someone else has to do that for him. But a priest can. Here's a good idea of what the garments look like. You see the guy with the white garment? That's a regular priest. And the other two is just the front and back of what a priestly high priest garment looks like. This is Yeshua, ultimately. And here's how. He comes to this earth, takes on our uncleanness to raise us out of the dust. Let me say that again. As God in the heavens, he can't atone for us. Just as the high priest can't atone for us on Yom Kippur Day wearing his high priest garments. So he has to change his garments and become an ordinary priest. He has to become more like the average person, an ordinary person. He has to become a man, more of a man. He's not as exalted anymore. And then he brings atonement. He takes away the uncleanness. He sacrifices his honor for his closest family. And it's kind of interesting because Yeshua, he's talking to his people. And he's talking and teaching the multitudes. And outside are his mother and brothers. And they tell him, your mother and brothers are outside, but what does he tell the people? He says, who are those who are my mothers and brothers? Those who do my will. That's you and me. Those of us who seek him to do his will. We're the ones, we're his closest family. We're the ones he came to earth to take our sin upon himself. At this time, I would like to open it up for discussion. I felt like there was going to be one more thing I was going to say, but sometimes I feel like there are times when we need to be quiet, and I think it's time to share. For you guys to share your thoughts too. Okay, 1 minute. John got the microphone, but you're next.
I'd like what you said, Donnie, especially as it relates to the beginning of Hebrews, the book of Hebrews, that describes Christ as becoming like his brethren in order to fully participate in our earthly life and to be able to atone for sin as a human and the God-man. And also, broadly speaking, these passages describe the priest and, as mentioned, the priesthood of all believers as having a very spelled out way of behaving. And they dressed in a certain way. They could not perform scarification, it was called. That was used by surrounding cultures for mourning and also for decorating their own skin, like tattoos are used today, I'm sorry to say. But anyway, the scarification was prohibited, and they were prescribed specific people who they could marry and not marry, when they could have sex even during the month. Their body was to be washed in a certain way. It was like they had come from an unregulated pagan culture. For instance, Laban, they stole his family gods when Jacob's wives left. So they came from a pagan culture. Ur of the Chaldees was a city, for example, that worshipped the moon goddess. And Abraham, of course, came out of that culture, not worshiping the moon goddess. But anyway, so they were very familiar with the rituals and customs of the pagans, and God prohibited them from participating in that culture. They were to be distinct. And in 1 Peter, it describes the Christian today as a holy and priesthood to God. He's not importing all of the meanings from the Old Testament necessarily, but he's warning people that their behavior was to be distinct from the surrounding culture in the same way. For example, the title Christian was given to the Christians because they were called little Christs, because Christians recognized that their behavior and their thinking needed to be transformed. To be different from the culture around them. Anyway, that's my input. Thanks.
That was pretty good. I like that. Thank you for sharing that, John. I'll comment on that. You know, the people, Abraham came out of Ur, the Chaldees, and they came out of the paganism of Egypt, and it is easy to go back to that if you don't have a system to train to keep that going.
I have a question and then a little something to say, but didn't they have to keep the candle burning all day and all night, the priests? That's what I was thinking, because you said that they'd have to light it in the morning and the night, but I thought when I was reading it, it said they had to keep it on all night. And the other thing is about the teaching on the children on the laps. You know, the priests need to teach the children on their laps so that they can follow. And that saddens me when I think of Aaron's two sons. That, I mean, I'm sure he taught them, but then they wanted to go in and they ended up dying.
Yeah.
That's very sad.
And there's, like I said, there's still debate over what they did. Was it right or wrong? And we know it was wrong, but was it really or not? So, but that was an interesting discussion. But I think it's sad maybe for someone like Aaron, who's trained his sons in the procedures, right? He trained them. Moses is also, Nadav and Abihu are not only called Aaron's sons. The Torah also calls them the sons of Moses, to show that one who teaches another man's children is likened to them as a father also. And so it was sad for both Moses and Aaron, because Moses and Aaron both poured so much into Nadav and Abihu. And they both poured so much into them to watch these two young men do what they did. Yes.
Thank you. I also thought it was interesting is in that same chapter where it talks about Aaron's two older sons, his two younger sons then go and do what Yah didn't prescribe as well. And Moses is distraught by that and asks, like, why did that happen? And Aaron's silent. So I think that's just interesting that none of his sons technically followed the letter that Yahweh had prescribed. But my question is, you were saying in Leviticus 24, when that young man profanes Yahweh's name, can you describe a little bit more? Because it does go into detail that the mother was an Israelite and the father was an Egyptian. And I didn't quite catch everything that you said about that.
Yeah, I glossed over that for lack of time, because how much time do we have? 15 minutes? Okay.
What chapter and verse?
It's chapter 24. I can't give you the exact verse, verse 10. So, she's called, they give her a name, right? And I'll just read you out of the commentary. So, it says, Vayetze ben Ishe Yisraelit, that's how you say it. And there went out a son of an Israelite woman, V'chu ben Ish Mitzri, and he was the son of an Egyptian man. Betok b'nei Israel, among the children of Israel. He went out amongst the children of Israel. And his mother's name was Shelomit, the daughter of Divri of the tribe of Dan. So the rabbis asked the question, where else do we see the term Ish Mitzri, an Egyptian man? And the answer is, there's kind of another reason why I glossed over this. Because in generally preparing the lessons each week, I try to make my material audience appropriate, if that makes sense. Because we have mixed audiences in here. Sometimes parents bring their kids in. So I try to not necessarily tame it. I'm like, if there are all adults in the room, I'm fine with that, sharing. So the Ish Mitri was, the rabbis say, is the man we hear about in Exodus chapter 2, the Egyptian man, who's beating a Hebrew slave. And the rabbis are like, why is he beating a Hebrew slave? They ask that question. And they say it's because that Hebrew slave's wife was involved in a relationship with that taskmaster, the Egyptian taskmaster. And from that union, we get this man here. It's based off asking where they get this from, the Ish Mitzri, right? In chapter 24 of Leviticus, and they say, where else is Ish Mitzri in the Bible? And they find it in Exodus chapter 2, the exact Hebrew phrase. So what's going on here is it's kind of interesting because we look at the mom's name, right? What's her name? Shelomit. Rashi says because she would babble. She would say, Shalom Alechem, Shalom Alach, going from people to people. She was a gossiper. Bat Divri, she would talk to the people. And she was not modest at all, according to what his opinion was. And it's kind of, I kind of take the opinion more that her name is Shelomit because it shows completeness, right? It shows shalom. And Bat Divri means the words of Torah, right? The Divrei, these are the Divrei of Torah of the tribe of Dan, which was the tribe that judged. But also, it was a tribe a lot of judges came out of, but also it was a tribe that frequently fell into idolatry. So you kind of have this family tree situation going on. And you're asking yourself, is this child that grows up from that, who one day curses God's name in the middle of the camp, is he growing up in a family situation where he's having a consistent source of godliness modeled to him? Because if you look at the way the children of the priests were supposed to be trained, from the moment they are as little can be, the Torah is made as a light to them. Right? The commandments of the priesthood are made as a delight to them. Not just by the father who is a priest, but also by the mother, because the father was very selective in choosing who he would marry. Because you wanted a woman who reflected the same values and the sanctity of that priesthood. So that child's growing up where the father and the mother are both instilling those values into that child. But we see here with this young man that he didn't get the instruction from both parents. He may have gotten it from the mother, but did he get it from the father? Regarding the situation about the affair between the Egyptian man and the mother, we don't know for sure if that is true. But we can look at the text itself and we can compare the end of the story to the beginning. At the beginning, we looked at how you had to be careful who you chose. If you were a priest, I had to choose someone who was not just an Israelite, but she also met this criteria. we didn't see this situation here with the man who cursed God's name. So that's kind of it more in detail for those of you who had any questions about that.
Donnie, I want to piggyback on what you just said, because the tribe of Dan is not listed in the 144,000s. That tribe is absent from that. So what you just explained, it kind of is ringing true that that was a mixed tribe, maybe throughout the generations.
So King Jeroboam, we're told in the second and the first temple period, when the kingdom was split between the 10 northern tribes and the 2 southern tribes, there were 2 golden calves built by King Jeroboam. He was the king of the northern kingdom. And those were built in Dan's territory. So that's an interesting thing. Can
And
you
then
guys still hear me?
I had one other comment to piggyback on what John was saying. And it just occurred to me as God is bringing the Israelites out of Egypt, and they've been under pagan practices. And so the severity of what they may not have understood, I'm thinking of when Yeshua said that if there is a demonic force in your house and you kick that demonic force out and it has no house to go to, it will bring 7 other spirits into the house. And I think this was, to me, it just occurred that this is part of what Yeshua, Adonai was doing with the Israelites, and I don't even think they understood that.
Yeah. Okay, they're showing me I got 5 minutes. Who else? Who else wants to share? It's getting quiet. Someone please raise your hand.
I just wondered if this the profanity from the Egyptian was taking the name of the Lord in vain, and if that's what it was, or if there was something more than just taking the Lord's name in vain, what happens to us if we slip up and take the Lord's name in vain? Are we to be put to death? Just wondered.
And I would respond with a question, which one of us in this room does not deserve to be put to death? Which one of us does not deserve to be put to death? On my way here this morning, I sometimes struggle with ungratefulness in my walk, where I'm like, why am I not where I need to be? And on the way here, you have those moments where you're just like driving in the car and you're alone with your thoughts. And I felt like God showed himself to me, like everything that's happened in the last couple of years especially of my life, about how he's been there. You can see how he opens doors, and how he opens doors in ways that you're like, he's actually doing this in my life. And I don't deserve any of this, but what we have is a relationship, and I don't understand why he loves me the way he loves me, or why he loves any of us the way he does. But he does, and he wants us to remember that, because it is so easy for us to forget it. And I don't know, I guess being in the Torah portions every week helps me, because it reminds me, I feel like God speaks to me every week. Not in like an audible voice. I mean, I read the Torah and it speaks to me. But regarding this young man, someone brought up the young man. You brought up about what was the details? And the rabbis actually have 2 opinions, which is very interesting. They say he was first arguing over the rule of the showbread, which happens in this Torah portion. talking about how pointless it is. And he was talking about that. And he got into a heated argument and used God's name as a cuss word, basically. Then the other one was the Israelite man he was arguing with was telling him, your father is an Egyptian, which means you have no tribal affiliation. You don't belong in the camp. And as wrong as that was of that Israelite, the young man, he did not react to that in a godly way. He took God's name. He's like, fine, and then he uses God's name, takes God's name in vain.
Did he take it in vain or did he curse God?
So let's look at it. He blasphemes the name of God. V'nokev Shem Hashem. He actually blasphemes the name of the God. He utters the tetragrammaton and he curses through it.
You just said two things. He blasphemes the God, and then you said he blasphemes God. So you just said two separate things.
So he uses God's name to utter a curse, is what he's doing.
A curse not being swearing, a curse being like a witch would cast a curse.
You could take that. I'm not 100% sure. But we do know his actions throws not necessarily perversion, but desecration onto the name of God. That's what we do know. It depends on how you say it, though. Are you saying it with reverence? Are you saying it, taking it lightly?
Well, lightly is different than casting a spell, especially if you're casting a spell on God.
Yeah.
That's how I read it, I guess.
Yeah, and you could be right. And like I said, I'm open to whatever interpretation you might have on that. The point is here, whatever he does not sanctify God's name, but brings desecration to God's name. Because we're told at the beginning of the chapter, the priests were not supposed to desecrate God's name. So, whatever he says, whatever comes out of his mouth is not a good thing.
We're in agreement on that.
And so, we're told that he, benakvo Shem, he that blasphemes the name of God, that is a verb, shall be put to death. But then there's debate over what does blaspheming the name of God look like. But we're saying he blasphemed the name of the God. The cause of it was an argument over being what his identity was. And I see the time, guys. I'm wrapping up. And also the things that God commanded in this Torah portion, like the showbread. He's like, this is a bunch of baloney. Right? This is a bunch of baloney. Why are we doing it? And it's all related to his identity. All three things are tied to the fact that this man does not know his identity as an Israelite. Because if he knew his identity as an Israelite, he would have understood that the table of showbread is a sacred thing. It's called a chuk olam, and it's called a brit olam, which is a sign of the covenant between him and God. Also, he would have known that he had a place in the camp, that God had a plan for him in the camp, that he belonged with Israel. And also, he would have known that he had a relationship with God himself, and he would not have dreamed of doing anything that would bring dishonor to God's name. He did not have a father who would teach him this thing because his father was an Egyptian. And Egypt was one of the most pagan cultures in the world at that time.
And you're saying Moses may have killed him.
May have killed his father. Here's another interesting thing. We're told that Moses killed the Egyptian. We're not exactly told how, but the rabbis, their opinion is that Moses killed the Egyptian by uttering the secret name of God. In the movie, he strangled him. In the movie, he strangled him. But it's kind of interesting how it goes. That's a rabbinic opinion. about how Moses killed the man's father, but yeah. Whatever way, the point of it is the man did not know his identity because his father did not instill it in him. His parents were not unified in instilling that in him. All right, let me close with a blessing over the Torah portion. Blessed are you, O Lord our God, King of the universe, who brings forth everlasting life in our midst. Amen.
We go with the rabbi version, where Moses killed him by uttering the secret name. And then the son knows that. He has no respect for that name. And it just makes sense.
Yeah.
That's a